A man stands alone on the porch of a house that no longer belongs to him. Keys still in his hand, unable to make himself knock. Inside, through the window, a woman he was married to for 24 years is laughing with their daughter over coffee, and neither of them looks up. He had once believed that walking away from her would feel like freedom. Instead, 3 years later, it feels like standing outside a life he threw away for someone who was never going to stay. Her silence, back then, had confused him. Now he understood it. She had not been weak when she said nothing. She had simply already known how the story would end. What Daniel Reyes did not know, standing on that porch, was that the woman inside had built something out of his absence that he would never be invited into again. This is the story of a man who mistook someone's stillness for surrender, and a woman who let his choices speak so she never had to. Daniel Reyes built his construction firm out of a single pickup truck and a business card he printed himself in 1998. By the time he turned 50, Reyes Construction and Development had its name on office parks, subdivisions, and a stretch of downtown Columbus that used to be a parking lot. People in the city knew him as a man who worked harder than anyone else in the room, and for most of his marriage to Claire, that reputation was earned honestly. Claire had been there for the version of Daniel that still answered his own phone, that still remembered anniversaries without an assistant reminding him. She had put her own teaching career on hold twice, first to raise their 2 children, and later to manage his company's books when he couldn't afford real staff. She was not a woman who asked for credit. She simply did the work and trusted that the man she married noticed. In the early years, before the company had a name that meant anything, Daniel used to tell Claire that everything he was building was for her, for the kind of life neither of them had grown up with. She believed him, and for a long time that belief was well placed. Their first house was small and needed work, and on weekends Daniel would frame walls with the same hands that later signed contracts worth millions, while Claire mixed paint colors and kept the ledger of every dollar they spent, because there was no room for waste. Those early years shaped the marriage more than either of them realized at the time. Claire learned to trust Daniel's word completely, because in those years his word was reliably good. That trust didn't disappear overnight later on. It eroded slowly, the way trust usually does, in small, unnoticed increments long before anyone was willing to call it what it was. For a long time, he did notice her sacrifices. But success has a way of rewriting what a man believes he deserves. As the company grew, Daniel spent less time at the dinner table and more time in boardrooms, and eventually more time with the newest hire on his project management team, a 34-year-old named Vanessa Cole. Vanessa was sharp, ambitious, and unfailingly attentive to Daniel in a way that felt, to him, like being seen again. He told himself the late nights at the office were about deadlines. He told himself the trips to survey new sites required 2 people, not 3. Claire never accused him of anything in those early months. She simply started noticing the small absences, the phone turned face down on the counter, the explanations that arrived a beat too fast, as if they had been rehearsed before she'd even asked a question. If you've ever sensed a shift in someone you love before you had any proof of it, you already understand the particular exhaustion Claire was carrying that year. She wasn't paranoid. She was paying attention. She started keeping the house exactly the way it always had been. Dinner at 7, his shirts pressed for Monday meetings, because she wasn't ready to blow up a life over a suspicion she couldn't yet prove. Some viewers will recognize this instinct immediately, the choice to hold steady while gathering the truth instead of reacting to a feeling. It is not weakness. It is often the most disciplined thing a person can do, and it is exactly what Claire chose to do for the better part of a year. Daniel's closest friend, a retired contractor named Robert who had known him since before the company existed, was one of the few people who noticed the change in him during that stretch. Over lunch one afternoon, Robert asked him plainly if everything was all right at home, and Daniel brushed the question off with the kind of laugh men use when they don't want to answer honestly. Robert didn't push. He had learned decades earlier that a man rarely listens to a warning until he's already decided to ignore it. Later, after everything unraveled, Robert would admit to Claire that he'd seen it coming long before she confronted Daniel, and that his biggest regret was not saying more when he still had the chance to. The proof, when it came, arrived the way it usually does, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through an ordinary mistake. Daniel left his tablet unlocked on the kitchen counter one evening while he showered, and a calendar notification popped up for a hotel reservation in Cleveland under his name and one other guest. Claire didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She sat at the kitchen table with the tablet in front of her and read every message in the thread twice, memorizing the dates, matching them against business trips she had once packed his bags for. By the time Daniel came downstairs in his robe, she already knew more about his affair than he assumed she ever could. What happened next is the part of this story that people remember because it wasn't loud. Claire didn't confront Daniel that night. She waited 3 days, gathering herself, deciding what kind of conversation she wanted to have and what kind of woman she wanted to be inside of it. When she finally spoke to him, she didn't raise her voice. She placed the printed messages on the kitchen table, the same table where she'd once helped him do payroll by hand, and asked him a single question. Did he want to end it, or did he want a divorce? Daniel, caught, did what many men in his position do. He apologized in the moment and asked for time. Claire gave him exactly 2 weeks, and used that time to quietly consult a lawyer, not out of vengeance, but because she had learned long ago that hope is not a plan. The lawyer Claire met with, a measured woman named Patricia who had handled dozens of cases exactly like hers, told her something during that first consultation that Claire carried with her for years afterward. She said that the clients who came out of divorce whole were rarely the ones who fought the loudest, but the ones who protected their own dignity first and let the settlement follow from that. Claire took the advice seriously. She didn't ask for more than she was entitled to, didn't threaten to expose Daniel to his business partners or the local press, even though she could have. She wanted out cleanly, with her name intact and her children spared from watching their parents tear each other apart in public. 2 weeks later, Daniel made his choice. Though he would spend years insisting he never actually chose anything, that things simply happened. What actually happened was that he continued seeing Vanessa, told himself it was temporary, and let the marriage dissolve through neglect rather than a clean break. Claire, for her part, refused to fight for a place she was no longer wanted in. When friends and family asked her what had gone wrong, she gave short, dignified answers and nothing more. She never once mentioned Vanessa's name publicly, never posted about it, never used their 2 adult children as messengers the way so many bitter divorces do. Her silence wasn't submission. It was a decision to let Daniel's actions be the only testimony anyone needed. That silence unsettled Daniel more than a screaming match ever could have. He had, in some private corner of his mind, expected a fight, expected Claire to beg him to stay or to publicly humiliate him the way he privately feared he deserved. Instead, she signed the paperwork without drama, took the modest settlement her lawyer negotiated, and moved into a smaller house near their daughter Emily's apartment. Daniel moved Vanessa into the home he and Claire had raised their children in, repainting the kitchen within a month, as if new paint could erase 24 years. Their son Nathan, 20 years old and furious in the specific way only a child watching a parent get hurt can be, stopped returning his father's calls almost entirely. Emily, older and more measured than her brother, handled the news differently. She didn't cut Daniel off, but she made it clear during one difficult phone call that she wasn't interested in hearing him explain or justify what had happened. She told him, calmly, that she loved him and always would, but that respecting her mother meant she wasn't going to pretend the last year hadn't happened. Daniel heard the same steadiness in his daughter's voice that he used to hear in Claire's, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite name at the time. It would take years before he understood that both women had learned the same lesson from watching him, that love and accountability were not opposites, and you could hold both at once. If there's one thing worth pausing on here, it's this. Daniel mistook Claire's composure for indifference. He told himself, and later told Vanessa, that Claire had probably seen it coming for years and simply didn't care enough to fight for the marriage. That belief made it easier for him to live with what he'd done. It would take him a long time to understand that composure and indifference are not the same thing, and that some of the strongest people you will ever meet are the ones who refuse to give their pain a stage. For the first year after the divorce, Daniel told himself he had made the right choice. Vanessa was younger, energetic, unburdened by 2 decades of shared history and its accumulated disappointments. She came to company events on his arm, and for a while, the attention felt like the vindication he'd been chasing without admitting it. But new relationships built on the wreckage of old ones tend to carry the same weight they were meant to escape, and slowly, the cracks that had once existed in his marriage began to reappear in a different shape entirely. Vanessa, it turned out, had ambitions of her own that had very little to do with Daniel specifically and a great deal to do with what his company could offer her. Vanessa had grown up watching her own mother stay in a marriage that offered stability but never actual partnership, and she had promised herself early on that she would never end up dependent on anyone the way her mother had been. On its own, that instinct wasn't a flaw, but in Vanessa, it had hardened into something closer to opportunism, a habit of measuring every relationship, personal or professional, by what it could ultimately provide her. Daniel had mistaken her attentiveness for devotion, when in truth it had always been a form of investment, one she intended to see returns on, whether those returns came in the form of love, a title, or eventually, an exit strategy towards something better. Within 18 months, Vanessa had pushed for a formal title change, moving from project coordinator to junior partner, a position Daniel granted partly out of guilt and partly because refusing felt, at the time, like admitting the whole arrangement had been a mistake. Employees who had worked under Claire's old bookkeeping systems noticed the shift immediately. Budgets that once balanced cleanly began slipping. Vendors who had trusted Reyes Construction for over a decade started asking questions about payment delays that never used to happen. Daniel, distracted by trying to keep his new relationship stable and his company afloat at the same time, didn't see what several of his longtime employees saw clearly. Vanessa was positioning herself for something bigger than a relationship with her boss. It's worth naming plainly what many viewers watching this kind of story already suspect. People who are willing to build a relationship on someone else's broken vows rarely feel obligated to honor vows themselves. Daniel had spent a year believing Vanessa's attentiveness was proof of genuine love. What he hadn't accounted for was that the same charm that once made him feel chosen could just as easily be aimed at someone else, someone with fewer complications and a cleaner reputation. If you're the kind of viewer who's seen this pattern before in your own life or in someone close to you, you already know where this story is heading, and if this is your first time recognizing it, it's worth remembering for later. The unraveling started with a name Daniel didn't recognize on a text message left open on Vanessa's phone, an echo of the exact mistake that had once ended his marriage, except this time he was on the receiving end. He confronted her the way Claire never got the chance to confront him properly, with raised voices, thrown accusations, and ultimately no real answers. Vanessa didn't deny it outright. She simply reminded him, coldly, that he of all people understood how these things happened. It was the first time Daniel heard his own old excuses repeated back to him, word for word, and something about hearing them from someone else's mouth made them sound as hollow as they had always actually been. By the time Daniel turned 55, the life he had built to replace his marriage was falling apart in almost every direction at once. Vanessa left within the year, taking a position at a rival firm across the city, one that, employees later whispered, she had been quietly courting for months before she ever packed a single box. She took with her not just her title, but a working knowledge of Reyes Construction's client relationships and pricing structures that made competing against her new employer significantly harder than Daniel had anticipated. The house he had repainted to erase Claire's memory sat half empty, a monument to a decision he was beginning to understand he'd made too quickly and for the wrong reasons entirely. One of the company's oldest clients, a family that had hired Reyes Construction for 3 separate developments over 15 years, quietly moved their 4th project to Vanessa's new firm that same year. When Daniel called to ask why, the answer he received was polite but unmistakable. They simply felt more confident in a team that seemed stable and organized, without anyone needing to say the word divorce out loud. That call stayed with Daniel longer than he expected it to. It wasn't the size of the contract that hurt. It was the quiet, almost gentle way an old client had told him, without ever intending cruelty, that his personal life had become a professional liability. The business, without Claire's steady hand on the books, and without the trust of longtime clients who had quietly drifted away after the divorce became public knowledge in their small professional circle, began bleeding money in ways Daniel struggled to explain even to himself. He hired accountants, consultants, anyone who might patch the holes Vanessa's departure had exposed. But the truth was simpler and harder to face than any spreadsheet could capture. A business built on relationships doesn't survive on talent alone. It survives on trust, and trust, once spent carelessly, is expensive to rebuild. Daniel had spent his without fully realizing the price until the bill came due. What made the collapse harder to bear wasn't the money. It was the isolation. His son Nathan had graduated college without inviting him to the ceremony, choosing instead to sit with his mother and sister in seats Daniel only learned about secondhand through a mutual friend. Emily kept in polite but distant contact, the kind reserved for someone you love out of obligation more than closeness. Daniel began attending Sunday dinners at his sister's house alone, watching families around him function in ways his own no longer did. And for the first time in years, he found himself thinking not about what he had gained by leaving Claire, but about everything he had quietly, permanently lost. It's tempting, watching a man like Daniel struggle, to feel nothing but satisfaction. Many of you watching this have lived through something similar, whether it was a marriage, a business partnership, or a friendship broken by someone choosing short-term desire over long-term loyalty. But the point of this story isn't punishment for its own sake. It's about what happens when a person mistakes stillness for weakness and discovers too late that the people who say the least are often the ones who understood the situation most clearly all along. Daniel didn't fall because Claire cursed him or plotted against him. He fell because the foundation he abandoned had been the only thing actually holding his life together. While Daniel's world was quietly falling apart, Claire's was doing something he never predicted, growing. In the 2 years following the divorce, she had gone back to teaching, first as a substitute, and then, once she completed the recertification courses she'd put off for decades, as a full-time high school history teacher at the same school her daughter had once attended. She wasn't chasing anything to prove Daniel wrong. She simply returned to a version of herself that had been set aside for other people's needs for far too long, and found, almost to her own surprise, that she was good at it, and that it made her genuinely happy in a way running a company's books never had. Her students, most of them teenagers navigating their own complicated home lives, gravitated toward her without knowing why. Claire never talked about her personal life in the classroom, but there was something in the way she carried herself, patient, unshaken, entirely present, that made students trust her more than most adults in their lives. One of her colleagues later told Emily that Claire had a way of making even the most difficult teenagers feel like they were being taken seriously for the first time. It wasn't a skill Claire had learned in a workshop. It was simply who she had always been underneath the years she'd spent managing someone else's company and someone else's needs. Claire never spoke publicly about the divorce, not to colleagues, not to new friends, not even to most extended family. When people asked, she gave the same short answer she always had. It didn't work out, and she was doing well now. That restraint, which Daniel had once mistaken for a lack of feeling, was in fact the exact opposite. Claire had feelings about what happened to her marriage that ran deep enough that she chose to protect them rather than perform them for an audience. She understood something many people never learn, that dignity is not the absence of pain. It is the decision not to let pain define how you show up in the world afterward. 2 years after the divorce, Claire began seeing someone new, a widowed contractor named Michael who had, coincidentally, once bid against Daniel's company for a public school renovation project years earlier. Their relationship developed slowly, without any of the urgency or secrecy that had defined Daniel's affair, and by the time Nathan and Emily met him, they didn't need convincing. He showed up consistently, remembered small details about their lives, and treated their mother with the kind of quiet respect that made the contrast to their father's behavior impossible to ignore. Claire hadn't built this new life to spite anyone. She had simply kept living, honestly and patiently, and the life that resulted from that honesty turned out to be sturdier than the one built on someone else's broken promises ever could be. Michael had lost his own wife to illness several years earlier, and something in the way he had grieved, openly and without shame, made Claire feel safe in a way she hadn't expected to feel again. He never asked her to explain what had happened in her marriage beyond what she volunteered on her own. He simply showed up, again and again, in the ordinary ways that mattered, remembering that Nathan preferred his coffee black, remembering the anniversary of Claire's mother's passing without being reminded, remembering small preferences most people forget within weeks of meeting someone. There was nothing dramatic about the way Michael loved her, and that was precisely the point. After 2 decades of learning to read Daniel's moods and manage his absences, Claire found something almost disorienting about being with a man who required no managing at all. It was in these small, unremarkable consistencies that Claire began to understand the real difference between being chosen out of convenience and being chosen deliberately, again and again, by someone who had nothing left to prove. If you've ever rebuilt something after a betrayal, whether it was a marriage, a friendship, or trust in yourself, you understand that the rebuilding rarely happens all at once. It happens in ordinary decisions repeated over months and years. Showing up to work, keeping your word, choosing patience over bitterness even when bitterness would have been easier and arguably justified. Claire's story resonates with so many viewers precisely because it isn't dramatic. It's the story of someone who got hurt badly and chose, deliberately, not to let that hurt turn her into someone she didn't want to be. That choice, more than anything Daniel did or didn't do, is what ultimately determined how each of their lives turned out. By the time Daniel found himself standing outside the house Claire now shared with Michael, 3 years after the divorce, he had lost the company's second-largest contract to the very rival firm Vanessa now worked for, watched his son graduate without him, and spent more nights than he wanted to admit sitting alone in an apartment that never quite felt like a home. He had come that evening, technically, to drop off a birthday gift for Nathan, who was staying with Claire that weekend. But standing on the porch, keys still in his hand from a life that no longer belonged to him, he understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that he wasn't just watching a family gathering through a window. He was watching what his own choices had cost him, laid out plainly in a kitchen he used to know. Claire eventually opened the door, polite and unbothered, the way she had learned to be around him over the years. She didn't gloat. She didn't bring up the past. She simply thanked him for the gift, told Nathan his father was here, and stepped back to let their son come out and greet him on the porch rather than inviting Daniel inside. It was such a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't lived the last 3 years the way Daniel had. But he understood exactly what it meant. He was no longer part of the world she had built. He had chosen to leave it, and she had simply let him go, no punishment necessary beyond the natural consequence of his own decisions playing out over time. Daniel drove home that night thinking, for the first time honestly, about what Claire's silence had actually been all those years ago. He had once believed it meant she didn't care enough to fight for their marriage. He understood now that it had meant something closer to self-respect, a refusal to beg someone to stay who had already decided to go. She hadn't needed to raise her voice, because she had never needed him to validate her worth in the first place. That, more than the lost contracts or the empty apartment, was the regret that settled into him hardest. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the one person in his life who had never once needed to prove anything to him, and had been quietly, steadily right about who he really was long before he was willing to admit it to himself. Vanessa's story didn't end well either, though Daniel only heard about it secondhand, through Robert, who still kept loose ties to people in the industry. At the rival firm, the same instincts that had once made her indispensable to Daniel eventually made her partners uneasy, and within 2 years she had cycled through another relationship with a senior executive there, one that ended just as abruptly and just as publicly as her time with Daniel had. She left that firm not long after, and the last Robert had heard, she was working independently, taking smaller contracts, no longer the rising name she'd once been on track to become. Daniel felt no satisfaction hearing it. If anything, it only sharpened the recognition that the pattern he'd once mistaken for love had simply been what it always was, a habit that eventually runs out of people willing to be used by it. A year later, Daniel sold what remained of Reyes Construction to a competitor, closing out a company he had built from nothing over almost 3 decades. He kept a small consulting role for himself, enough to stay busy, enough to feel useful, but the fire that once drove him to work 80-hour weeks had quietly gone out somewhere along the way. He moved into a modest condo across town, and on weekends, when Nathan and Emily allowed it, he began showing up to family gatherings not as the man who used to run the room, but as someone learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to earn back a place he had once taken entirely for granted. It was slower going than he expected, and some days it didn't go well at all. Nathan still kept his answers short. Emily still watched him carefully, the way a person watches whether they've been burned by before. But he kept showing up anyway, week after week, because he had finally learned what showing up was actually worth, and how much it had cost him to learn that lesson only after it was too late to matter where it once mattered most. There is a particular kind of quiet that some people mistake for weakness, right up until the moment its true strength becomes impossible to ignore. Claire never raised her voice, never begged, never let anyone see how deeply Daniel's choice had wounded her, and in the years that followed, that same quiet became the foundation for a life more stable and more honest than anything built on his side of the divorce. If this story reminded you of someone you know, or maybe reminded you of your own quiet strength during a hard chapter of your life, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is made for. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next story is one you won't want to miss either.